Chapter 22. As Miriam struggled with Malbian, her hands pinioned to her sides by his brawny grip, hope died within her. She did not utter a sound, for she knew that there was none to come to her assistance, and too, the jungle training of her earlier life had taught her the futility of appeals for succor in the savage world of her upbringing. But as she fought to free herself, one hand came in contact with the butt of Malbian's revolver where it rested in the holster at his hip. Slowly he was dragging her toward the blankets, and slowly her fingers encircled the coveted prize and drew it from its resting place. Then, as Malbian stood at the edge of the disordered pile of blankets, Miriam suddenly ceased to draw away from him, and as quickly hurled her weight against him, with the result that he was thrown backward. His feet stumbled against the bedding and he was hurled to his back. Instinctively his hands flew out to save himself, and at the same instant Miriam leveled the revolver at his breast and pulled the trigger. But the hammer fell futilely upon an empty shell, and Malbian was again upon his feet, clutching at her. For a moment she eluded him and ran toward the entrance to the tent, but at the very doorway his heavy hand fell upon her shoulder and dragged her back. Wheeling upon him with the fury of a wounded lioness, Miriam grasped the long revolver by the barrel, swung it high above her head and crashed it down full in Malbian's face. With an oath of pain and rage the man staggered backward, releasing his hold upon her, and then sank unconscious to the ground. Without a backward look, Miriam turned and fled into the open. Several of the blacks saw her and tried to intercept her flight, but the menace of the empty weapon kept them at a distance, and so she won beyond the encircling boma and disappeared into the jungle to the south. Straight into the branches of a tree she went, true to the arboreal instincts of the little Mangani she had been, and here she stripped off her riding skirt, her shoes and her stockings, for she knew that she had before her a journey and a flight which would not brook the burden of these garments. Her riding breeches and jacket would have to serve as protection from cold and thorns, nor would they hamper her over much, but a skirt and shoes were impossible among the trees. She had not gone far before she commenced to realize how slight were her chances for survival without means of defense or a weapon to bring down meat. Why had she not thought to strip the cartridge belt from Malbian's waist before she had left his tent? With cartridges for the revolver she might hope to bag small game, and to protect herself from all but the most ferocious of the enemies that would beset her way back to the beloved hearthstone of Bwana and my dear. With the thought came determination to return and obtain the coveted ammunition. She realized that she was taking great chances of recapture, but without means of defense, and of obtaining meat she felt that she could never hope to reach safety. And so she turned her face back toward the camp from which she had but just escaped. She thought Malbian dead, so terrific a blow had she dealt him, and she hoped to find an opportunity after dark to enter the camp and search his tent for the cartridge belt. But scarcely had she found a hiding place in a great tree at the edge of the boma where she could watch without danger of being discovered, when she saw the Swede emerge from his tent, wiping blood from his face and hurling a volley of oaths and questions at his terrified followers. Shortly after, the entire camp set forth in search of her, and when Miriam was positive that all were gone, she descended from her hiding place and ran quickly across the clearing to Malbian's tent. A hasty survey of the interior revealed no ammunition, but in one corner was a box in which were packed the Swede's personal belongings that he had sent along by his headman to this westerly camp. Miriam seized the receptacle as the possible container of extra ammunition. Quickly she loosed the cords that held the canvas covering about the box, and a moment later had raised the lid and was rummaging through the heterogeneous accumulation of odds and ends within. There were letters and papers and cuttings from old newspapers, and among other things the photograph of a little girl, upon the back of which was pasted a cutting from a Paris daily, a cutting that she could not read. Yellowed and dimmed by age and handling, but something about the photograph of the little girl, which was also reproduced in the newspaper cutting, held her attention. Where had she seen that picture before? And then, quite suddenly, it came to her that this was a picture of herself as she had been years and years before. Where had it been taken? How had it come into the possession of this man? Why had it been reproduced in a newspaper? What was the story that the faded type told of it? Miriam was baffled by the puzzle that her search for ammunition had revealed. She stood gazing at the faded photograph for a time, and then bethought herself of the ammunition for which she had come. Turning again to the box, she rummaged to the bottom, and there in a corner she came upon a little box of cartridges. A single glance assured her that they were intended for the weapon she had thrust inside the band of her riding breeches, and slipping them into her pocket, she turned once more for an examination of the baffling likeness of herself that she held in her hand. As she stood thus in vain endeavor to fathom this inexplicable mystery, the sound of voices broke upon her ears, Instantly she was all alert. They were coming closer. A second later she recognized the lurid profanity of the Swede. Malbien, her persecutor, was returning. Miriam ran quickly to the opening of the tent and looked out. It was too late. She was fairly cornered. The white man and 3 of his black henchmen were coming straight across the clearing toward the tent. What was she to do? She slipped the photograph into her waist. Quickly she slipped a cartridge into each of the chambers of the revolver. Then she backed toward the end of the tent, keeping the entrance covered by her weapon. The man stopped outside and Miriam could hear Malbien profanely issuing instructions. He was a long time about it, and while he talked in his bellowing, brutish voice, the girl sought some avenue of escape. Stooping, she raised the bottom of the canvas and looked beneath and beyond. There was no one in sight upon that side. Throwing herself upon her stomach, she wormed beneath the tent wall, just as Malbien, with a final word to his men, entered the tent. Miriam heard him cross the floor, and then she rose and, stooping low, ran to a native hut directly behind. Once inside this, she turned and glanced back. There was no one in sight. She had not been seen. And now from Malbien's tent she heard a great cursing. The Swede had discovered the rifling of his box. He was shouting to his men, and as she heard them reply, Miriam darted from the hut and ran toward the edge of the boma furthest from Malbien's tent. Overhanging the boma at this point was a tree that had been too large, in the eyes of the rest-loving blacks, to cut down, so they had terminated the boma just short of it. Miriam was thankful for whatever circumstance had resulted in the leaving of that particular tree where it was, since it gave her the much-needed avenue of escape which she might not otherwise have had. From her hiding place she saw Malbien again enter the jungle, this time leaving a guard of 3 of his boys in the camp. He went toward the south, and after he had disappeared, Miriam skirted the outside of the enclosure and made her way to the river. Here lay the canoes that had been used in bringing the party from the opposite shore. They were unwieldy things for a lone girl to handle, but there was no other way, and she must cross the river. The landing place was in full view of the guard at the camp. To risk the crossing under their eyes would have meant undoubted capture. Her only hope lay in waiting until darkness had fallen, unless some fortuitous circumstance should arise before. For an hour she lay watching the guard, one of whom seemed always in a position where he would immediately discover her should she attempt to launch one of the canoes. Presently Malbien appeared, coming out of the jungle, hot and puffing. He ran immediately to the river where the canoes lay and counted them. It was evident that it had suddenly occurred to him that the girl must cross here if she wished to return to her protectors. The expression of relief on his face when he found that none of the canoes was gone was ample evidence of what was passing in his mind. He turned and spoke hurriedly to the head man who had followed him out of the jungle and with whom were several other blacks. Following Malbien's instructions, they launched all the canoes but one. Malbien called to the guards in the camp, and a moment later the entire party had entered the boats and were paddling upstream. Miriam watched them until a bend in the river directly above the camp hid them from her sight. They were gone. She was alone, and they had left a canoe in which lay a paddle. She could scarce believe the good fortune that had come to her. To delay now would be suicidal to her hopes. Quickly she ran from her hiding place and dropped to the ground. A dozen yards lay between her and the canoe. Upstream, beyond the bend, Malbien ordered his canoes in to shore. He landed with his headman and crossed the little point slowly in search of a spot where he might watch the canoe he had left at the landing place. He was smiling in anticipation of the almost certain success of his stratagem. Sooner or later the girl would come back and attempt to cross the river in one of their canoes. It might be that the idea would not occur to her for some time. They might have to wait a day or 2 days, but that she would come if she lived or was not captured by the men he had scouting the jungle for her, Malbien was sure. That she would come so soon, however, he had not guessed, and so when he topped the point and came again within sight of the river, he saw that which drew an angry oath from his lips. His quarry already was halfway across the river. Turning, he ran rapidly back to his boats, the headman at his heels. Throwing themselves in, Malbien urged his paddlers to their most powerful efforts. The canoes shot out into the stream and down with the current toward the fleeing quarry. She had almost completed the crossing when they came in sight of her. At the same instant she saw them, and redoubled her efforts to reach the opposite shore before they should overtake her. 2 minutes' start of them was all Miriam cared for. Once in the trees she knew that she could outdistance and elude them. Her hopes were high they could not overtake her now she had had too good a start of them. Malbien, urging his men onward with a stream of hideous oaths and blows from his fists, realized that the girl was again slipping from his clutches. The leading canoe, in the bow of which he stood, was yet 100 yards behind the fleeing Miriam when she ran the point of her craft beneath the overhanging trees on the shore of safety. Malbien screamed to her to halt. He seemed to have gone mad with rage at the realization that he could not overtake her, and then he threw his rifle to his shoulder, aimed carefully at the slim figure scrambling into the trees, and fired. Malbien was an excellent shot. His misses at so short a distance were practically non-existent, nor would he have missed this time but for an accident occurring at the very instant that his finger tightened upon the trigger, an accident to which Miriam owed her life, the providential presence of a waterlogged tree trunk, one end of which was embedded in the mud of the river bottom, and the other end of which floated just beneath the surface where the prow of Malbien's canoe ran upon it as he fired. The slight deviation of the boat's direction was sufficient to throw the muzzle of the rifle out of aim. The bullet whizzed harmlessly by Miriam's head, and an instant later she had disappeared into the foliage of the tree. There was a smile on her lips as she dropped to the ground to cross a little clearing where once had stood a native village surrounded by its fields. The ruined huts still stood in crumbling decay. The rank vegetation of the jungle overgrew the cultivated ground. Small trees already had sprung up in what had been the village street, but desolation and loneliness hung like a pall above the scene. To Miriam, however, it presented but a place denuded of large trees which she must cross quickly to regain the jungle upon the opposite side before Malbien should have landed. The deserted huts were, to her, all the better because they were deserted. She did not see the keen eyes watching her from a dozen points, from tumbling doorways, from behind tottering granaries. In utter unconsciousness of impending danger, she started up the village street because it offered the clearest pathway to the jungle. A mile away toward the east, fighting his way through the jungle along the trail taken by Malbien when he had brought Miriam to his camp, a man in torn khaki, filthy, haggard, unkempt, came to a sudden stop as the report of Malbien's rifle resounded faintly through the tangled forest. The black man just ahead of him stopped too. "We are almost there, Bwana," he said. There was awe and respect in his tone and manner. The white man nodded and motioned his ebon guide forward once more. It was the Honorable Morrison Baines, the fastidious, the exquisite. His face and hands were scratched and smeared with dried blood from the wounds he had come by in thorn and thicket. His clothes were tatters. But through the blood and the dirt and the rags a new Baines shone forth, a handsomer Baines than the dandy and the fop of yore. In the heart and soul of every son of woman lies the germ of manhood and honor, remorse for a scurvy act, and an honorable desire to right the wrong he had done the woman he now knew he really loved had excited these germs to rapid growth in Morrison Baines, and the metamorphosis had taken place. Onward the two stumbled toward the point from which the single rifle shot had come. The black was unarmed Baines, fearing his loyalty had not dared trust him even to carry the rifle which the white man would have been glad to be relieved of many times upon the long march, but now that they were approaching their goal. And knowing as he did that hatred of Malbien burned hot in the black man's brain, Baines handed him the rifle, for he guessed that there would be fighting. He intended that there should, for he had come to avenge himself. An excellent revolver shot would depend upon the smaller weapon at his side. As the two forged ahead toward their goal, they were startled by a volley of shots ahead of them. Then came a few scattering reports, some savage yells and silence. Baines was frantic in his endeavors to advance more rapidly, but there the jungle seemed 1,000 times more tangled than before. A dozen times he tripped and fell. Twice the black followed a blind trail and they were forced to retrace their steps, but at last they came out into a little clearing near the Big Afiaya, clearing that once held a thriving village, but lay somber and desolate in decay and ruin. In the jungle vegetation that overgrew what had once been the main village street, lay the body of a black man, pierced through the heart with a bullet, and still warm. Baines and his companion looked about in all directions, but no sign of living being could they discover. They stood in silence, listening intently. What was that? Voices and the dip of paddles out upon the river. Baines ran across the dead village toward the fringe of jungle upon the river's brim. The black was at his side. Together they forced their way through the screening foliage until they could obtain a view of the river, and there, almost to the other shore, they saw Malbien's canoes making rapidly for camp. The black recognized his companions immediately. "How can we cross?" asked Baines. The black shook his head. There was no canoe, and the crocodiles made it equivalent to suicide to enter the water in an attempt to swim across. Just then the fellow chanced to glance downward. Beneath him, wedged among the branches of a tree, lay the canoe in which Miriam had escaped. The Negro grasped Bain's arm and pointed toward his find. The Honorable Morrison could scarce repress a shout of exultation. Quickly the two slid down the drooping branches into the boat. The black seized the paddle and Baines shoved them out from beneath the tree. A second later the canoe shot out upon the bosom of the river and headed toward the opposite shore and the camp of the Swede. Baines squatted in the bow, straining his eyes after the men pulling the other canoes upon the bank across from him. He saw Malbien step from the bow of the foremost of the little craft. He saw him turn and glance back across the river. He could see his start of surprise as his eyes fell upon the pursuing canoe and called the attention of his followers to it. Then he stood waiting, for there was but one canoe and two men, little danger to him and his followers in that. Malbien was puzzled. Who was this white man? He did not recognize him, though Bain's canoe was now in midstream and the features of both its occupants plainly discernible to those on shore. One of Malbien's blacks it was who first recognized his fellow black in the person of Bain's companion. Then Malbien guessed who the white man must be, though he could scarce believe his own reasoning. It seemed beyond the pale of wildest conjecture to suppose that the Honorable Morrison Baines had followed him through the jungle with but a single companion, and yet it was true. Beneath the dirt and dishevelment he recognized him at last, and in the necessity of admitting that it was he, Malbien was forced to recognize the incentive that had driven Baines, the weakling and coward, through the savage jungle upon his trail. The man had come to demand an accounting and to avenge. It seemed incredible, and yet there could be no other explanation. Malbien shrugged. Well, others had sought Malbien for similar reasons in the course of a long and checkered career. He fingered his rifle and waited. Now the canoe was within easy speaking distance of the shore. "What do you want?" yelled Malbien, raising his weapon threateningly. The Honorable Morrison Baines leaped to his feet. "You, damn you," he shouted, whipping out his revolver and firing almost simultaneously with the Swede. As the two reports rang out, Malbien dropped his rifle, clutched frantically at his breast, staggered, fell first to his knees, and then lunged upon his face. Baines stiffened. His head flew back spasmodically. For an instant he stood thus, and then crumpled very gently into the bottom of the boat. The black paddler was at a loss as to what to do. If Malbien really were dead, he could continue on to join his fellows without fear, but should the Swede only be wounded, he would be safer upon the far shore. Therefore he hesitated, holding the canoe in midstream. He had come to have considerable respect for his new master and was not unmoved by his death. As he sat gazing at the crumpled body in the bow of the boat, he saw it move. Very feebly the man essayed to turn over. He still lived. The black moved forward and lifted him to a sitting position. He was standing in front of him, his paddle in one hand, asking Baines where he was hit when there was another shot from shore, and the Negro pitched headlong overboard, his paddle still clutched in his dead fingers, shot through the forehead. Baines turned weakly in the direction of the shore to see Malbien drawn up upon his elbows, leveling his rifle at him. The Englishman slid to the bottom of the canoe as a bullet whizzed above him. Malbien, sore hit, took longer in aiming, nor was his aim as sure as formerly. With difficulty Baines turned himself over on his belly and, grasping his revolver in his right hand, drew himself up until he could look over the edge of the canoe. Malbien saw him instantly and fired, but Baines did not flinch or duck. With painstaking care he aimed at the target upon the shore, from which he now was drifting with the current. His finger closed upon the trigger. There was a flash and a report, and Malbien's giant frame jerked to the impact of another bullet. But he was not yet dead. Again he aimed and fired, the bullet splintering the gunwale of the canoe close by Baines' face. Baines fired again as his canoe drifted further downstream, and Malbien answered from the shore, where he lay in a pool of his own blood. And thus, doggedly, the two wounded men continued to carry on their weird duel until the winding African river had carried the Honorable Morrison Baines out of sight around a wooded point. Chapter 23. Miriam had traversed half the length of the village street when a score of white-robed Negroes and half-castes leaped out upon her from the dark interiors of surrounding huts. She turned to flee, but heavy hands seized her, and when she turned at last to plead with them, her eyes fell upon the face of a tall, grim, old man glaring down upon her from beneath the folds of his burnous. At sight of him she staggered back in shocked and terrified surprise. It was the sheikh. Instantly all the old fears and terrors of her childhood returned upon her. She stood trembling before this horrible old man, as a murderer before the judge about to pass sentence of death upon him. She knew that the sheikh recognized her. The years and the changed raiment had not altered her so much, but what one who had known her features so well in childhood would know her now. "So you have come back to your people," each snarled the sheikh. "Come back begging for food and protection, eh?" "Let me go," cried the girl. "I ask nothing of you but that you let me go back to the big bwana." The big bwana, almost screamed the sheikh, and then followed a stream of profane, Arabic invective against the white man whom all the transgressors of the jungle feared and hated. "You would go back to the big bwana, would you? So that is where you have been since you ran away from me, is it? And who comes now across the river after you, the big bwana?" "The Swede whom you once chased away from your country when he and his companion conspired with Nbida to steal me from you," replied Miriam. The sheikh's eyes blazed, and he called his men to approach the shore and hide among the bushes that they might ambush and annihilate Malbian and his party. But Malbian already had landed, and crawling through the fringe of jungle was at that very moment looking with wide and incredulous eyes upon the scene being enacted in the street of the deserted village. He recognized the sheikh the moment his eyes fell upon him. There were two men in the world that Malbian feared as he feared the devil. One was the big bwana and the other the sheikh. A single glance he took at that gaunt, familiar figure, and then he turned tail and scurried back to his canoe, calling his followers after him. And so it happened that the party was well out in the stream before the sheikh reached the shore, and after a volley and a few parting shots that were returned from the canoes, the Arab called his men off and, securing his prisoner, set off toward the south. One of the bullets from Malbian's force had struck a black standing in the village street, where he had been left with another to guard Miriam, and his companions had left him where he had fallen, after appropriating his apparel and belongings. His was the body that Baines had discovered when he had entered the village. The sheikh and his party had been marching southward along the river when one of them, dropping out of line to fetch water, had seen Miriam paddling desperately from the opposite shore. The fellow had called the sheikh's attention to the strange sight, a white woman alone in Central Africa, and the old Arab had hidden his men in the deserted village to capture her when she landed, for thoughts of ransom were always in the mind of the sheikh. More than once before had glittering gold filtered through his fingers from a similar source. It was easy money, and the sheikh had none too much easy money, since the big bwana had so circumscribed the limits of his ancient domain that he dared not even steal ivory from natives within 200 miles of the big bwana's douar. And when at last the woman had walked into the trap he had set for her, and he had recognized her as the same little girl he had brutalized and maltreated years before, his gratification had been huge. Now he lost no time in establishing the old relations of father and daughter that had existed between them in the past. At the first opportunity he struck her a heavy blow across the face. He forced her to walk when he might have dismounted one of his men instead, or had her carried on a horse's rump. He seemed to revel in the discovery of new methods for torturing or humiliating her, and among all his followers she found no single one to offer her sympathy, or who dared defend her, even had they had the desire to do so. A 2 days' march brought them at last to the familiar scenes of her childhood, and the first face upon which she set her eyes as she was driven through the gates into the strong stockade was that of the toothless, hideous Mabunu, her one-time nurse. It was as though all the years that had intervened were but a dream. Had it not been for her clothing and the fact that she had grown in stature, she might well have believed it so. All was there as she had left it. The new faces which supplanted some of the old were of the same bestial, degraded type. There were a few young Arabs who had joined the sheikh since she had been away, otherwise all was the same, all but one. Gika was not there, and she found herself missing Gika, as though the ivory-headed one had been a flesh and blood intimate and friend. She missed her ragged little confidante, into whose deaf ears she had been wont to pour her many miseries and her occasional joys. Gika, of the splinter limbs and the rat-skin torso. Gika, the disreputable Gika, the beloved. For a time the inhabitants of the sheikh's village, who had not been upon the march with him, amused themselves by inspecting the strangely clad white girl, whom some of them had known as a little child. Mabunu pretended great joy at her return, baring her toothless gums in a hideous grimace that was intended to be indicative of rejoicing, but Miriam could but shudder as she recalled the cruelties of this terrible old hag in the years gone by. Among the Arabs who had come in her absence was a tall young fellow of 20, a handsome, sinister-looking youth, who stared at her in open admiration until the sheikh came and ordered him away, and Abdul Kamak went scowling. At last, their curiosity satisfied, Miriam was alone. As of old, she was permitted the freedom of the village, for the stockade was high and strong, and the only gates were well guarded by day, and by night, but as of old she cared not for the companionship of the cruel Arabs and the degraded blacks who formed the following of the sheikh, and so, as had been her wont in the sad days of her childhood, she slunk down to an unfrequented corner of the enclosure where she had often played at housekeeping with her beloved Gika beneath the spreading branches of the great tree that had overhung the palisade, but now the tree was gone. And Miriam guessed the reason. It was from this tree that Korak had descended and struck down the sheikh the day that he had rescued her from the life of misery and torture that had been her lot for so long that she could remember no other. There were low bushes growing within the stockade, however, and in the shade of these Miriam sat down to think. A little glow of happiness warmed her heart as she recalled her first meeting with Korak and then the long years that he had cared for and protected her with the solicitude and purity of an elder brother. For months Korak had not so occupied her thoughts as he did today. He seemed closer and dearer now than ever he had before, and she wondered that her heart had drifted so far from loyalty to his memory. And then came the image of the Honourable Morrison, the exquisite, and Miriam was troubled. Did she really love the flawless young Englishman? She thought of the glories of London, of which he had told her in such glowing language. She tried to picture herself admired and honoured in the midst of the gayest society of the great capital. The pictures she drew were the pictures that the Honourable Morrison had drawn for her. They were alluring pictures, but through them all the brawny, half-naked figure of the giant Adonis of the jungle persisted in obtruding itself. Miriam pressed her hand above her heart as she stifled a sigh, and as she did so she felt the hard outlines of the photograph she had hidden there as she slunk from Malbeen's tent. Now she drew it forth and commenced to re-examine it more carefully than she had had time to do before. She was sure that the baby face was hers. She studied every detail of the picture. Half hidden in the lace of the dainty dress rested a chain and locket. Miriam puckered her brows. What tantalizing half-memories it awakened. Could this flower of evident civilization be the little Arab Miriam, daughter of the sheikh? It was impossible, and yet that locket. Miriam knew it. She could not refute the conviction of her memory. She had seen that locket before, and it had been hers. What strange mystery lay buried in her past? As she sat gazing at the picture, she suddenly became aware that she was not alone, that someone was standing close behind her, someone who had approached her noiselessly. Guiltily she thrust the picture back into her waist. The hand fell upon her shoulder. She was sure that it was the sheikh, and she awaited in dumb terror the blow that she knew would follow. No blow came, and she looked upward over her shoulder into the eyes of Abdul Kamak, the young Arab. "I saw," he said, "the picture that you have just hidden. It is you when you were a child, a very young child. May I see it again?" Miriam drew away from him. "I will give it back," he said. "I have heard of you, and I know that you have no love for the sheikh, your father. Neither have I. I will not betray you. Let me see the picture." Friendless among cruel enemies, Miriam clutched at the straw that Abdul Kamak held out to her. Perhaps in him she might find the friend she needed. Anyway, he had seen the picture, and if he was not a friend, he could tell the sheikh about it, and it would be taken away from her. So she might as well grant his request and hope that he had spoken fairly and would deal fairly. She drew the photograph from its hiding place and handed it to him. Abdul Kamak examined it carefully, comparing it feature by feature with the girl sitting on the ground looking up into his face. Slowly he nodded his head. "Yes," he said, "it is you, but where was it taken? How does it happen that the sheikh's daughter is clothed in the garments of the unbeliever?" "I do not know," replied Miriam. "I never saw the picture until a couple of days ago when I found it in the tent of the Swede Malbeen." Abdul Kamak raised his eyebrows. He turned the picture over, and as his eyes fell upon the old newspaper cutting, they went wide. He could read French, with difficulty it is true, but he could read it. He had been to Paris. He had spent 6 months there with a troop of his desert fellows upon exhibition, and he had improved his time, learning many of the customs, some of the language, and most of the vices of his conquerors. Now he put his learning to use. Slowly, laboriously, he read the yellowed cutting. His eyes were no longer wide. Instead, they narrowed to 2 slits of cunning. When he had done, he looked at the girl. "You have read this?" he asked. "It is French," she replied, "and I do not read French." Abdul Kamak stood long in silence looking at the girl. She was very beautiful. He desired her, as had many other men who had seen her. At last he dropped to one knee beside her. A wonderful idea had sprung to Abdul Kamak's mind. It was an idea that might be furthered if the girl were kept in ignorance of the contents of that newspaper cutting. It would certainly be doomed should she learn its contents. "Miriam," he whispered. Never until today have my eyes beheld you, yet at once they told my heart that it must ever be your servant. You do not know me, but I ask that you trust me. I can help you. You hate the sheikh, so do I. Let me take you away from him. Come with me. And we will go back to the great desert where my father is a sheikh mightier than is yours. Will you come? Miriam sat in silence. She hated to wound the only one who had offered her protection and friendship, but she did not want Abdul-Kamak's love. Deceived by her silence, the man seized her and strained her to him, but Miriam struggled to free herself. I do not love you, she cried. Oh, please do not make me hate you. You are the only one who has shown kindness toward me, and I want to like you, but I cannot love you. Abdul-Kamak drew himself to his full height. You will learn to love me, he said, for I shall take you whether you will or no. You hate the sheikh, and so you will not tell him, for if you do I will tell him of the picture. I hate the sheikh, and... You hate the sheikh, came a grim voice from behind them. Both turned to see the sheikh standing a few paces from them. Abdul still held the picture in his hand. Now he thrust it within his burnous. Yes, he said, I hate the sheikh. And as he spoke he sprang toward the older man, felled him with a blow and dashed on across the village to the line where his horse was picketed, saddled and ready, for Abdul-Kamak had been about to ride forth to hunt when he had seen the stranger girl alone by the bushes. Leaping into the saddle, Abdul-Kamak dashed for the village gates. The sheikh, momentarily stunned by the blow that had felled him, now staggered to his feet, shouting lustily to his followers to stop the escaped Arab. A dozen blacks leaped forward to intercept the horseman, only to be ridden down or brushed aside by the muzzle of Abdul-Kamak's long musket, which he lashed from side to side about him as he spurred on toward the gate. But here he must surely be intercepted. Already the two blacks stationed there were pushing the unwieldy portals to. Up flew the barrel of the fugitive's weapon. With reins flying loose and his horse at a mad gallop, the son of the desert fired once, twice, and both the keepers of the gate dropped in their tracks. With a wild whoop of exultation, twirling his musket high above his head and turning in his saddle to laugh back into the faces of his pursuers, Abdul-Kamak dashed out of the village of the sheikh and was swallowed up by the jungle. Foaming with rage, the sheikh ordered immediate pursuit, and then strode rapidly back to where Miriam sat huddled by the bushes where he had left her. The picture, he cried. What picture did the dog speak of? Where is it? Give it to me at once. He took it, replied Miriam dully. What was it again? Demanded the sheikh, seizing the girl roughly by the hair and dragging her to her feet, where he shook her venomously. What was it a picture of? Of me, said Miriam, when I was a little girl. I stole it from Malbian, the Swede. It had printing on the back, cut from an old newspaper. The sheikh went white with rage. What said the printing? He asked in a voice so low that she but barely caught his words. I do not know. It was in French, and I cannot read French. The sheikh seemed relieved. He almost smiled, nor did he again strike Miriam before he turned and strode away with the parting admonition that she speak never again to any other than Mabunu and himself. And along the caravan trail galloped Abdul-Kamak toward the north. As his canoe drifted out of sight and range of the wounded Swede, the Honourable Morrison sank weakly to its bottom, where he lay for long hours in partial stupor. It was night before he fully regained consciousness, and then he lay for a long time looking up at the stars and trying to recollect where he was, what accounted for the gently rocking motion of the thing upon which he lay, and why the position of the stars changed so rapidly and miraculously. For a while he thought he was dreaming, but when he would have moved to shake sleep from him, the pain of his wound recalled to him the events that had led up to his present position. Then it was that he realized that he was floating down a great African river in a native canoe alone, wounded and lost. Painfully he dragged himself to a sitting position. He noticed that the wound pained him less than he had imagined it would. He felt of it gingerly. It had ceased to bleed. Possibly it was but a flesh wound after all, and nothing serious. If it totally incapacitated him, even for a few days, it would mean death, for by that time he would be too weakened by hunger and pain to provide food for himself. From his own troubles his mind turned to Miriam's. That she had been with the Swede at the time he had attempted to reach the fellow's camp he naturally believed, but he wondered what would become of her now. Even if Hansen died of his wounds, would Miriam be any better off? She was in the power of equally villainous men, brutal savages of the lowest order. Baines buried his face in his hands and rocked back and forth as the hideous picture of her fate burned itself into his consciousness. And it was he who had brought this fate upon her. His wicked desire had snatched a pure and innocent girl from the protection of those who loved her to hurl her into the clutches of the bestial Swede and his outcast following. And not until it had become too late had he realized the magnitude of the crime he himself had planned and contemplated. Not until it had become too late had he realized that greater than his desire, greater than his lust, greater than any passion he had ever felt before was the newborn love that burned within his breast for the girl he would have ruined. The Honourable Morrison Baines did not fully realize the change that had taken place within him. Had one suggested that he ever had been aught than the soul of honour and chivalry, he would have taken umbrage forthwith. He knew that he had done a vile thing when he had plotted to carry Miriam away to London, yet he excused it on the ground of his great passion for the girl having temporarily warped his moral standards by the intensity of its heat. But, as a matter of fact, a new Baines had been born. Never again could this man be bent to dishonour by the intensity of a desire. His moral fibre had been strengthened by the mental suffering he had endured. His mind and his soul had been purged by sorrow and remorse. His one thought now was to atone win to Miriam's side and lay down his life, if necessary, in her protection. His eyes sought the length of the canoe in search of the paddle, for a determination had galvanized him to immediate action despite his weakness and his wound. But the paddle was gone. He turned his eyes toward the shore. Dimly through the darkness of a moonless night he saw the awful blackness of the jungle, yet it touched no responsive chord of terror within him now, as it had done in the past. He did not even wonder that he was unafraid, for his mind was entirely occupied with thoughts of another's danger. Drawing himself to his knees, he leaned over the edge of the canoe and commenced to paddle vigorously with his open palm. Though it tired and hurt him, he kept assiduously at his self-imposed labor for hours. Little by little the drifting canoe moved nearer and nearer the shore. The Honourable Morrison could hear a lion roaring directly opposite him, and so close that he felt he must be almost to the shore. He drew his rifle closer to his side, but he did not cease to paddle. After what seemed to the tired man an eternity of time, he felt the brush of branches against the canoe and heard the swirl of the water about them. A moment later he reached out and clutched a leafy limb. Again the lion roared, very near it seemed now, and Baines wondered if the brute could have been following along the shore waiting for him to land. He tested the strength of the limb to which he clung. It seemed strong enough to support a dozen men. Then he reached down and lifted his rifle from the bottom of the canoe, slipping the sling over his shoulder. Again he tested the branch, and then reaching upward as far as he could for a safe hold, he drew himself painfully and slowly upward until his feet swung clear of the canoe, which, released, floated silently from beneath him to be lost forever in the blackness of the dark shadows downstream. He had burned his bridges behind him. He must either climb aloft or drop back into the river, but there had been no other way. He struggled to raise one leg over the limb, but found himself scarce equal to the effort, for he was very weak. For a time he hung there, feeling his strength ebbing. He knew that he must gain the branch above at once, or it would be too late. Suddenly the lion roared almost in his ear. Baines glanced up. He saw two spots of flame a short distance from and above him. The lion was standing on the bank of the river, glaring at him and waiting for him. Well, thought the Honourable Morrison, let him wait. Lions can't climb trees, and if I get into this one I shall be safe enough from him. The young Englishman's feet hung almost to the surface of the water, closer than he knew, for all was pitch dark below as above him. Presently he heard a slight commotion in the river beneath him, and something banged against one of his feet, followed almost instantly by a sound that he felt he could not have mistaken the click of great jaws snapping together. "By George," exclaimed the Honourable Morrison, aloud. "The beggar nearly got me," and immediately he struggled again to climb higher into comparative safety, but with that final effort he knew that it was futile. Hope that had survived persistently until now began to wane. He felt his tired, numbed fingers slipping from their hold. He was dropping back into the river, into the jaws of the frightful death that awaited him there. And then he heard the leaves above him rustle to the movement of a creature among them. The branch to which he clung bent beneath an added weight, and no light weight. From the way it sagged, but still Baines clung desperately. He would not give up voluntarily either to the death above or the death below. He felt a soft, warm pad upon the fingers of one of his hands where they circled the branch to which he clung, and then something reached down out of the blackness above and dragged him up among the branches of the tree. Chapter 24. Sometimes lolling upon Tantor's back, sometimes roaming the jungle in solitude, Korak made his way slowly toward the west and south. He made but a few miles a day, for he had a whole lifetime before him, and no place in particular to go. Possibly he would have moved more rapidly but for the thought which continually haunted him that each mile he traversed carried him further and further away from Miriam, no longer his Miriam, as of yore it is true, but still as dear to him as ever. Thus he came upon the trail of the sheik's band as it travelled downriver from the point where the sheik had captured Miriam to his own stockaded village. Korak pretty well knew who it was that had passed, for there were few in the great jungle with whom he was not familiar, though it had been years since he had come this far north. He had no particular business, however, with the old sheik, and so he did not propose following him. The further from men he could stay, the better pleased he would be. He wished that he might never see a human face again. Men always brought him sorrow and misery. The river suggested fishing, and so he dawdled upon its shores, catching fish after a fashion of his own devising and eating them raw. When night came, he curled up in a great tree beside the stream, the one from which he had been fishing during the afternoon, and was soon asleep. Numa, roaring beneath him, awoke him. He was about to call out in anger to his noisy neighbor when something else caught his attention. He listened. Was there something in the tree beside himself? Yes, he heard the noise of something below him trying to clamber upward. Presently he heard the click of a crocodile's jaws in the waters beneath, and then, low but distinct, by George. The beggar nearly got me. The voice was familiar. Korak glanced downward toward the speaker. Outlined against the faint luminosity of the water, he saw the figure of a man clinging to a lower branch of the tree. Silently and swiftly the ape-man clambered downward. He felt a hand beneath his foot. He reached down and clutched the figure beneath him and dragged it up among the branches. It struggled weakly and struck at him, but Korak paid no more attention than Tantor to an ant. He lugged his burden to the higher safety and greater comfort of a broad crotch, and there he propped it in a sitting position against the bole of the tree. Numa still was roaring beneath them, doubtless in anger that he had been robbed of his prey. Korak shouted down at him, calling him, in the language of the great apes, old green-eyed eater of carrion, brother of Dango the hyena, and other choice appellations of jungle opprobrium. The Honourable Morrison Baines, listening, felt assured that a gorilla had seized upon him. He felt for his revolver, and as he was drawing it stealthily from its holster, a voice asked in perfectly good English, "Who are you?" Baines started so that he nearly fell from the branch. "My God," he exclaimed. "Are you a man?" "What did you think I was?" asked Korak. "A gorilla," replied Baines honestly. Korak laughed. "Who are you?" he repeated. "I'm an Englishman by the name of Baines, but who the devil are you?" asked the Honourable Morrison. "They call me the Killer," replied Korak, giving the English translation of the name that Akut had given him. And then, after a pause, during which the Honourable Morrison attempted to pierce the darkness and catch a glimpse of the features of the strange being into whose hands he had fallen, "You are the same whom I saw kissing the girl at the edge of the great plain to the east. That time that the lion charged you." "Yes," replied Baines. "What are you doing here?" "The girl was stolen. I am trying to rescue her." "Stolen?" The word was shot out like a bullet from a gun. "Who stole her?" "The Swede trader Hansen," replied Baines. "Where is he?" Baines related to Korak all that had transpired since he had come upon Hansen's camp. Before he was done, the first grey dawn had relieved the darkness. Korak made the Englishman comfortable in the tree. He filled his canteen from the river and fetched him fruits to eat. Then he bid him goodbye. "I am going to the Swede's camp," he announced. "I will bring the girl back to you here." "I shall go too," then insisted Baines. "It is my right and my duty, for she was to have become my wife." Korak winced. "You are wounded, you could not make the trip," he said. "I can go much faster alone." "Go," then replied Baines, "but I shall follow. It is my right and duty." "As you will," replied Korak, with a shrug. If the man wanted to be killed, it was none of his affair. He wanted to kill him himself, but for Miriam's sake he would not. If she loved him, then he must do what he could to preserve him, but he could not prevent his following him, more than to advise him against it, and this he did, earnestly. And so Korak set out rapidly toward the north, and limping slowly and painfully along, soon far to the rear came the tired and wounded Baines. Korak had reached the river bank opposite Malbian's camp before Baines had covered 2 miles. Late in the afternoon, the Englishman was still plodding wearily along, forced to stop often for rest when he heard the sound of the galloping feet of a horse behind him. Instinctively he drew into the concealing foliage of the underbrush, and a moment later a white-robed Arab dashed by. Baines did not hail the rider. He had heard of the nature of the Arabs who penetrate thus far to the south, and what he had heard had convinced him that a snake or a panther would as quickly befriend him as one of these villainous renegades from the Northland. When Abdul Kamak had passed out of sight toward the north, Baines resumed his weary march. A half-hour later he was again surprised by the unmistakable sound of galloping horses. This time there were many. Once more he sought a hiding place, but it chanced that he was crossing a clearing which offered little opportunity for concealment. He broke into a slow trot, the best that he could do in his weakened condition, but it did not suffice to carry him to safety, and before he reached the opposite side of the clearing a band of white-robed horsemen dashed into view behind him. At sight of him they shouted in Arabic, which of course he could not understand, and then they closed about him, threatening and angry. Their questions were unintelligible to him, and no more could they interpret his English. At last, evidently out of patience, the leader ordered 2 of his men to seize him, which they lost no time in doing. They disarmed him and ordered him to climb to the rump of one of the horses, and then the 2 who had been detailed to guard him turned and rode back toward the south, while the others continued their pursuit of Abdul Kamak. As Korak came out upon the bank of the river across from which he could see the camp of Malbien, he was at a loss as to how he was to cross. He could see men moving about among the huts inside the boma. Evidently Hansen was still there. Korak did not know the true identity of Miriam's abductor. How was he to cross? Not even he would dare the perils of the river, almost certain death. For a moment he thought, then wheeled and sped away into the jungle, uttering a peculiar cry, shrill and piercing. Now and again he would halt to listen as though for an answer to his weird call, then on again, deeper and deeper and deeper into the wood. At last his listening ears were rewarded by the sound they craved, the trumpeting of a bull elephant, and a few moments later Korak broke through the trees into the presence of Tantor, standing with upraised trunk, waving his great ears. "Quick," Tantor shouted the ape-man, and the beast swung him to his head. Hurry, and the mighty pachyderm lumbered off through the jungle, guided by kicking of naked heels against the sides of his head. Toward the northwest Korak guided his huge mount, until they came out upon the river a mile or more above the Swedes' camp, at a point where Korak knew that there was an elephant ford. Never pausing, the ape-man urged the beast into the river, and with trunk held high Tantor forged steadily toward the opposite bank. Once an unwary crocodile attacked him, but the sinuous trunk dove beneath the surface and, grasping the amphibian about the middle, dragged it to light and hurled it 100 feet downstream. And so in safety they made the opposite shore, Korak perched high and dry above the turgid flood. Then back toward the south Tantor moved, steadily, relentlessly, and with a swinging gait which took no heed of any obstacle other than the larger jungle trees. At times Korak was forced to abandon the broad head and take to the trees above, so close the branches raked the back of the elephant, but at last they came to the edge of the clearing where lay the camp of the renegade Swede, nor even then did they hesitate or halt. The gate lay upon the east side of the camp, facing the river. Tantor and Korak approached from the north. There was no gate there, but what cared Tantor or Korak for gates? At a word from the ape-man, and raising his tender trunk high above the thorns, Tantor breasted the boma, walking through it as though it had not existed. A dozen blacks squatted before their huts looked up at the noise of his approach. With sudden howls of terror and amazement they leaped to their feet and fled for the open gates. Tantor would have pursued. He hated man, and he thought that Korak had come to hunt these, but the ape-man held him back, guiding him toward a large canvas tent that rose in the center of the clearing. There should be the girl and her abductor. Malbien lay in a hammock beneath canopy before his tent. His wounds were painful and he had lost much blood. He was very weak. He looked up in surprise as he heard the screams of his men and saw them running toward the gate. And then from around the corner of his tent loomed a huge bulk, and Tantor, the great tusker, towered above him. Malbien's boy, feeling neither affection nor loyalty for his master, broke and ran at the first glimpse of the beast, and Malbien was left alone and helpless. The elephant stopped a couple of paces from the wounded man's hammock. Malbien cowered, moaning. He was too weak to escape. He could only lie there with staring eyes gazing in horror into the blood-rimmed, angry little orbs fixed upon him, and await his death. Then, to his astonishment, a man slid to the ground from the elephant's back. Almost at once Malbien recognized the strange figure, as that of the creature who consorted with apes and baboons, the white warrior of the jungle who had freed the king baboon and led the whole angry horde of hairy devils upon him and Jensen. Malbeen cowered still lower. "Where is the girl?" demanded Korak in English. "What girl?" asked Malbeen. "There is no girl here, only the women of my boys. Is it one of them you want?" "The white girl," replied Korak. "Do not lie to me. You lured her from her friends. You have her. Where is she?" "It was not I," cried Malbeen. "It was an Englishman who hired me to steal her. He wished to take her to London with him. She was willing to go. His name is Baines. Go to him if you want to know where the girl is." "I have just come from him," said Korak. "He sent me to you. The girl is not with him. Now stop your lying and tell me the truth. Where is she?" Korak took a threatening step toward the Swede. Malbeen shrank from the anger in the other's face. "I will tell you," he cried. "Do not harm me and I will tell you all that I know. I had the girl here, but it was Baines who persuaded her to leave her friends. He had promised to marry her. He does not know who she is, but I do. And I know that there is a great reward for whoever takes her back to her people. It was the only reward I wanted. But she escaped and crossed the river in one of my canoes. I followed her, but the sheik was there, God knows how. And he captured her and attacked me and drove me back. Then came Baines, angry because he had lost the girl, and shot me. If you want her, go to the sheik and ask him for her. She has passed as his daughter since childhood." "She is not the sheik's daughter?" asked Korak. "She is not," replied Malbeen. "Who is she then?" asked Korak. Here Malbeen saw his chance. Possibly he could make use of his knowledge. After all, it might even buy back his life for him. He was not so credulous as to believe that this savage ape man would have any compunctions about slaying him. "When you find her, I will tell you," he said, "if you will promise to spare my life and divide the reward with me. If you kill me, you will never know, for only the sheik knows and he will never tell. The girl herself is ignorant of her origin." "If you have told me the truth, I will spare you," said Korak. "I shall go now to the sheik's village, and if the girl is not there, I shall return and slay you. As for the other information you have, if the girl wants it when we have found her, we will find a way to purchase it from you." The look in the killer's eyes and his emphasis of the word purchase were none too reassuring to Malbeen. Evidently, unless he found means to escape, this devil would have both his secret and his life before he was done with him. He wished he would be gone and take his evil-eyed companion away with him, the swaying bulk towering high above him, and the ugly little eyes of the elephant watching his every move made Malbeen nervous. Korak stepped into the Swede's tent to assure himself that Miriam was not hid there. As he disappeared from view, Tantor, his eyes still fixed upon Malbeen, took a step nearer the man. An elephant's eyesight is none too good, but the great tusker evidently had harbored suspicions of this yellow-bearded white man from the first. Now he advanced his snake-like trunk toward the Swede, who shrank still deeper into his hammock. The sensitive member felt and smelled back and forth along the body of the terrified Malbeen. Tantor uttered a low, rumbling sound. His little eyes blazed. At last he had recognized the creature who had killed his mate long years before. Tantor, the elephant, never forgets and never forgives. Malbeen saw in the demoniacal visage above him the murderous purpose of the beast. He shrieked aloud to Korak, "Help! Help! The devil is going to kill me!" Korak ran from the tent just in time to see the enraged elephant's trunk encircle the beast's victim, and then hammock, canopy, and man were swung high over Tantor's head. Korak leaped before the animal, commanding him to put down his prey unharmed, but as well might he have ordered the eternal river to reverse its course. Tantor wheeled around like a cat, hurled Malbeen to the earth, and kneeled upon him with the quickness of a cat. Then he gored the prostrate thing through and through with his mighty tusks, trumpeting and roaring in his rage, and at last convinced that no slightest spark of life remained in the crushed and lacerated flesh. He lifted the shapeless clay that had been Sven Malbeen far aloft and hurled the bloody mass, still entangled in canopy and hammock, over the boma and out into the jungle. Korak stood looking sorrowfully on at the tragedy he gladly would have averted. He had no love for the Swede, in fact only hatred, but he would have preserved the man for the sake of the secret he possessed. Now that secret was gone forever unless the sheik could be made to divulge it, but in that possibility Korak placed little faith. The ape-man, as unafraid of the mighty Tantor as though he had not just witnessed his shocking murder of a human being, signaled the beast to approach and lift him to its head, and Tantor came as he was bid, docile as a kitten, and hoisted the killer tenderly aloft. From the safety of their hiding places in the jungle, Malbion's boys had witnessed the killing of their master, and now, with wide, frightened eyes, they saw the strange white warrior, mounted upon the head of his ferocious charger, disappear into the jungle at the point from which he had emerged upon their terrified vision. Chapter 25. The sheikh glowered at the prisoner which his two men brought back to him from the north. He had sent the party after Abdul Kamak, and he was wroth that instead of his erstwhile lieutenant they had sent back a wounded and useless Englishman. Why had they not dispatched him where they had found him? He was some penniless beggar of a trader who had wandered from his own district and became lost. He was worthless. The sheikh scowled terribly upon him. "Who are you?" he asked in French. "I am the Honourable Morrison Baines of London," replied his prisoner. The title sounded promising, and at once the wily old robber had visions of ransom. His intentions, if not his attitude toward the prisoner, underwent a change he would investigate further. "What were you doing poaching in my country?" growled he. "I was not aware that you owned Africa," replied the Honourable Morrison. "I was searching for a young woman who had been abducted from the home of a friend. The abductor wounded me and I drifted downriver in a canoe. I was on my way back to his camp when your men seized me." "A young woman?" asked the sheikh. "Is that she?" and he pointed to his left over toward a clump of bushes near the stockade. Baines looked in the direction indicated and his eyes went wide, for there, sitting cross-legged upon the ground, her back toward them, was Miriam. "Miriam," he shouted, starting toward her, but one of his guards grasped his arm and jerked him back. The girl leaped to her feet and turned toward him as she heard her name. "Morrison," she cried. "Be still, and stay where you are," snapped the sheikh, and then to Baines, "So you are the dog of a Christian who stole my daughter from me." "Your daughter," ejaculated Baines. "She is your daughter." "She is my daughter," growled the Arab, "and she is not for any unbeliever. You have earned death, Englishman, but if you can pay for your life, I will give it to you." Baines' eyes were still wide at the unexpected sight of Miriam here in the camp of the Arab when he had thought her in Hanson's power. What had happened? How had she escaped the Swede? Had the Arab taken her by force from him, or had she escaped and come voluntarily back to the protection of the man who called her daughter? He would have given much for a word with her. If she was safe here, he might only harm her by antagonizing the Arab in an attempt to take her away and return her to her English friends. No longer did the Honourable Morrison harbour thoughts of luring the girl to London. "Well," asked the sheikh. "Oh," exclaimed Baines, "I beg your pardon, I was thinking of something else." "Why, yes, of course, glad to pay, I'm sure. How much do you think I'm worth?" The sheikh named a sum that was rather less exorbitant than the Honourable Morrison had anticipated. The latter nodded his head in token of his entire willingness to pay. He would have promised a sum far beyond his resources just as readily. For he had no intention of paying anything. His one reason for seeming to comply with the sheikh's demands was that the wait for the coming of the ransom money would give him the time and the opportunity to free Miriam if he found that she wished to be free. The Arab's statement that he was her father naturally raised the question in the Honourable Morrison's mind as to precisely what the girl's attitude toward escape might be. It seemed, of course, preposterous that this fair and beautiful young woman should prefer to remain in the filthy douar of an illiterate old Arab rather than return to the comforts, luxuries, and congenial associations of the hospitable African bungalow from which the Honourable Morrison had tricked her. The man flushed at the thought of his duplicity, which these recollections aroused thoughts which were interrupted by the sheikh, who instructed the Honourable Morrison to write a letter to the British consul at Algiers, dictating the exact phraseology of it with a fluency that indicated to his captive that this was not the first time the old rascal had had occasion to negotiate with English relatives for the ransom of a kinsman. Baines demurred when he saw that the letter was addressed to the consul at Algiers, saying that it would require the better part of a year to get the money back to him, but the sheikh would not listen to Baines' plan to send a messenger directly to the nearest coast town, and from there communicate with the nearest cable station, sending the Honourable Morrison's request for funds straight to his own solicitors. No, the sheikh was cautious and wary. He knew his own plan had worked well in the past. In the other were too many untried elements. He was in no hurry for the money. He could wait a year, or 2 years if necessary, but it should not require over 6 months. He turned to one of the Arabs who had been standing behind him and gave the fellow instructions in relation to the prisoner. Baines could not understand the words spoken in Arabic, but the jerk of the thumb toward him showed that he was the subject of conversation. The Arab addressed by the sheikh bowed to his master and beckoned Baines to follow him. The Englishman looked toward the sheikh for confirmation. The latter nodded impatiently, and the Honourable Morrison rose and followed his guide toward a native hut, which lay close beside one of the outside goatskin tents. In the dark, stifling interior, his guard led him, then stepped to the doorway and called to a couple of black boys squatting before their own huts. They came promptly, and in accordance with the Arab's instructions bound Baines' wrists and ankles securely. The Englishman objected strenuously, but as neither the blacks nor the Arab could understand a word he said, his pleas were wasted. Having bound him, they left the hut. The Honourable Morrison lay for a long time contemplating the frightful future which awaited him during the long months which must intervene before his friends learned of his predicament and could get succor to him. Now he hoped that they would send a ransom. He would gladly pay all that he was worth to be out of this hole. At first it had been his intention to cable his solicitors to send no money but to communicate with the British West African authorities and have an expedition sent to his aid. His patrician nose wrinkled in disgust as his nostrils were assailed by the awful stench of the hut. The nasty grasses upon which he lay exuded the effluvium of sweaty bodies, of decayed animal matter, and of offal. But worse was yet to come. He had lain in the uncomfortable position in which they had thrown him but for a few minutes when he became distinctly conscious of an acute itching sensation upon his hands, his neck and scalp. He wriggled to a sitting posture, horrified and disgusted. The itching rapidly extended to other parts of his body. It was torture, and his hands were bound securely at his back. He tugged and pulled at his bonds until he was exhausted, but not entirely without hope, for he was sure that he was working enough slack out of the knot to eventually permit of his withdrawing one of his hands. Night came. They brought him neither food nor drink. He wondered if they expected him to live on nothing for a year. The bites of the vermin grew less annoying, though not less numerous. The Honourable Morrison saw a ray of hope in this indication of future immunity through inoculation. He still worked weakly at his bonds, and then the rats came. If the vermin were disgusting, the rats were terrifying. They scurried over his body, squealing and fighting. Finally one commenced to chew at one of his ears. With an oath, the Honourable Morrison struggled to a sitting posture. The rats retreated. He worked his legs beneath him and came to his knees, and then by superhuman effort rose to his feet. There he stood, reeling drunkenly, dripping with cold sweat. God, he muttered, what have I done to deserve? He paused. What had he done? He thought of the girl in another tent in that accursed village. He was getting his deserts. He set his jaws firmly with the realization. He would never complain again. At that moment he became aware of voices raised angrily in the goatskin tent close beside the hut in which he lay. One of them was a woman's. Could it be Miriam's? The language was probably Arabic. He could not understand a word of it, but the tones were hers. He tried to think of some way of attracting her attention to his near presence. If she could remove his bonds, they might escape together if she wished to escape. That thought bothered him. He was not sure of her status in the village. If she were the petted child of the powerful sheikh, then she would probably not care to escape. He must know definitely. At the bungalow he had often heard Miriam sing God Save the King, as my dear accompanied her on the piano. Raising his voice, he now hummed the tune. Immediately he heard Miriam's voice from the tent. She spoke rapidly. Goodbye, Morrison, she cried. If God is good, I shall be dead before morning, for if I still live, I shall be worse than dead after tonight. Then he heard an angry exclamation in a man's voice, followed by the sounds of a scuffle. Baines went white with horror. He struggled frantically again with his bonds. They were giving. A moment later one hand was free. It was but the work of an instant then to loose the other. Stooping, he untied the rope from his ankles. Then he straightened and started for the hut doorway, bent on reaching Miriam's side. As he stepped out into the night, the figure of a huge black rose and barred his progress. When speed was required of him, Korak depended upon no other muscles than his own, and so it was that the moment Tantor had landed him safely upon the same side of the river as lay the village of the sheikh, the ape. Man deserted his bulky comrade and took to the trees in a rapid race toward the south and the spot where the Swede had told him Miriam might be. It was dark when he came to the palisade, strengthened considerably since the day that he had rescued Miriam from her pitiful life within its cruel confines. No longer did the giant tree spread its branches above the wooden rampart, but ordinary man-made defenses were scarce considered obstacles by Korak. Loosening the rope at his waist, he tossed the noose over one of the sharpened posts that composed the palisade. A moment later his eyes were above the level of the obstacle, taking in all within their range beyond. There There was no one in sight close by, and Korak drew himself to the top and dropped lightly to the ground within the enclosure. Then he commenced his stealthy search of the village. First toward the Arab tents he made his way, sniffing and listening. He passed behind them, searching for some sign of Miriam. Not even the wild Arab curs heard his passage, so silently he went as shadow passing through shadows. The odor of tobacco told him that the Arabs were smoking before their tents. The sound of laughter fell upon his ears, and then from the opposite side of the village came the notes of a once familiar tune, God Save the King. Korak halted in perplexity. Who might it be? The tones were those of a man. He recalled the young Englishman he had left on the river trail, and who had disappeared before he returned. A moment later there came to him a woman's voice in reply. It was Miriam's, and the killer quickened into action, slunk rapidly in the direction of these two voices. The evening meal over, Miriam had gone to her pallet in the women's quarters of the sheik's tent, a little corner screened off in the rear by a couple of priceless Persian rugs to form a partition. In these quarters she had dwelt with Mabunu alone, for the sheik had no wives. Nor were conditions altered now. After the years of her absence, she and Mabunu were alone in the women's quarters. Presently the sheik came and parted the rugs. He glared through the dim light of the interior. "Miriam," he called, "come hither." The girl arose and came into the front of the tent. There the light of a fire illuminated the interior. She saw Ali Ben Kadin, the sheik's half-brother, squatted upon a rug, smoking. The sheik was standing. The sheik and Ali Ben Kadin had had the same father, but Ali Ben Kadin's mother had been a slave, a West Coast negress. Ali Ben Kadin was old and hideous and almost black. His nose and part of one cheek were eaten away by disease. He looked up and grinned as Miriam entered. The sheik jerked his thumb toward Ali Ben Kadin and addressed Miriam. "I am getting old," he said. "I shall not live much longer. Therefore I have given you to Ali Ben Kadin, my brother." That was all. Ali Ben Kadin rose and came toward her. Miriam shrank back, horrified. The man seized her wrist. "Come," he commanded, and dragged her from the sheik's tent and to his own. After they had gone, the sheik chuckled. "When I send her north in a few months," he soliloquized, "they will know the reward for slaying the son of the sister of Amor Ben Katur." And in Ali Ben Kadin's tent Miriam pleaded and threatened, but all to no avail. The hideous old half-caste spoke soft words at first, but when Miriam loosed upon him the vials of her horror and loathing, he became enraged, and rushing upon her seized her in his arms. Twice she tore away from him, and in one of the intervals during which she managed to elude him, she heard Bain's voice humming the tune that she knew was meant for her ears. At her reply, Ali Ben Kadin rushed upon her once again. This time he dragged her back into the rear apartment of his tent, where three negresses looked up in stolid indifference to the tragedy being enacted before them. As the Honorable Morrison saw his way blocked by the huge frame of the giant black, his disappointment and rage filled him with a bestial fury that transformed him into a savage beast. With an oath he leapt upon the man before him, the momentum of his body hurling the black to the ground. There they fought, the black to draw his knife, the white to choke the life from the black. Bain's fingers shut off the cry for help that the other would have been glad to voice, but presently the Negro succeeded in drawing his weapon, and an instant later Baines felt the sharp steel in his shoulder. Again and again the weapon fell. The white man removed one hand from its choking grip upon the black throat. He felt around upon the ground beside him, searching for some missile, and at last his fingers touched a stone and closed upon it. Raising it above his antagonist's head, the Honorable Morrison drove home a terrific blow. Instantly the black relaxed, stunned. Twice more Baines struck him. Then he leaped to his feet and ran for the goatskin tent, from which he had heard the voice of Miriam in distress. But before him was another. Naked but for his leopard skin and his loincloth, Korak, the killer, slunk into the shadows at the back of Ali Ben Kadin's tent. The half-caste had just dragged Miriam into the rear chamber as Korak's sharp knife slit a 6-foot opening in the tent wall, and Korak, tall and mighty, sprang through upon the astonished visions of the inmates. Miriam saw and recognized him the instant that he entered the apartment. Her heart leaped in pride and joy at the sight of the noble figure for which it had hungered for so long. "Korak," she cried. "Miriam," he uttered the single word as he hurled himself upon the astonished Ali Ben Kadin. The three negresses leaped from their sleeping mats, screaming. Miriam tried to prevent them from escaping, but before she could succeed, the terrified blacks had darted through the hole in the tent wall made by Korak's knife, and were gone screaming through the village. The killer's fingers closed once upon the throat of the hideous Ali. Once his knife plunged into the putrid heart, and Ali Ben Kadeen lay dead upon the floor of his tent. Korak turned toward Miriam, and at the same moment a bloody and disheveled apparition leaped into the apartment. "Morrison," cried the girl. Korak turned and looked at the newcomer. He had been about to take Miriam in his arms, forgetful of all that might have transpired since last he had seen her. Then the coming of the young Englishman recalled the scene he had witnessed in the little clearing, and a wave of misery swept over the ape-man. Already from without came the sounds of the alarm that the three negresses had started. Men were running toward the tent of Ali Ben Kadeen. There was no time to be lost. "Quick," cried Korak, turning toward Baines, who had scarce yet realized whether he was facing a friend or foe. "Take her to the palisade, following the rear of the tents. Here is my rope. With it you can scale the wall and make your escape." "But you, Korak," cried Miriam. "I will remain," replied the ape-man. "I have business with the sheikh." Miriam would have demurred, but the killer seized them both by the shoulders and hustled them through the slit wall and out into the shadows beyond. "Now run for it," he admonished, and turned to meet and hold those who were pouring into the tent from the front. The ape-man fought as he had never fought before, but the odds were too great for victory, though he won that which he most craved: time for the Englishman to escape with Miriam. Then he was overwhelmed by numbers, and a few minutes later, bound and guarded, he was carried to the sheikh's tent. The old man eyed him in silence for a long time. He was trying to fix in his own mind some form of torture that would gratify his rage and hatred toward this creature who twice had been the means of his losing possession of Miriam. The killing of Ali Ben Kadeen caused him little anger. Always had he hated the hideous son of his father's hideous slave. The blow that this naked white warrior had once struck him added fuel to his rage. He could think of nothing adequate to the creature's offense. And as he sat there looking upon Korak, the silence was broken by the trumpeting of an elephant in the jungle beyond the palisade. A half-smile touched Korak's lips. He turned his head a trifle in the direction from which the sound had come, and then there broke from his lips a low, weird call. One of the blacks guarding him struck him across the mouth with the haft of his spear, but none there knew the significance of his cry. In the jungle, Tantor cocked his ears as the sound of Korak's voice fell upon them. He approached the palisade and, lifting his trunk above it, sniffed. Then he placed his head against the wooden logs and pushed, but the palisade was strong and only gave a little to the pressure. In the sheikh's tent, the sheikh rose at last, and pointing toward the bound captive, turned to one of his lieutenants. "Burn him," he commanded, "at once. The stake is set." The guard pushed Korak from the sheikh's presence. They dragged him to the open space in the center of the village, where a high stake was set in the ground. It had not been intended for burnings, but offered a convenient place to tie up refractory slaves that they might be beaten oft times until death relieved their agonies. And to this stake they bound Korak. Then they brought brush and piled about him, and the sheikh came and stood by that he might watch the agonies of his victim. But Korak did not wince even after they had fetched a brand and the flames had shot up among the dry tinder. Once then he raised his voice in the low call that he had given in the sheikh's tent, and now from beyond the palisade came again the trumpeting of an elephant. Old Tantor had been pushing at the palisade in vain. The sound of Korak's voice calling him, and the scent of man, his enemy, filled the great beast with rage and resentment against the dumb barrier that held him back. He wheeled and shuffled back a dozen paces. Then he turned, lifted his trunk, and gave voice to a mighty roaring, trumpet call of anger, lowered his head, and charged like a huge battering ram of flesh and bone and muscle straight for the mighty barrier. The palisade sagged and splintered to the impact, and through the breach rushed the infuriated bull. Korak heard the sounds that the others heard, and he interpreted them as the others did not. The flames were creeping closer to him when one of the blacks, hearing a noise behind him, turned to see the enormous bulk of Tantor lumbering toward them. The man screamed and fled, and then the bull elephant was among them, tossing Negroes and Arabs to right and left as he tore through the flames he feared to the side of the comrade he loved. The sheikh, calling orders to his followers, ran to his tent to get his rifle. Tantor wrapped his trunk about the body of Korak and the stake to which it was bound, and tore it from the ground. The flames were searing his sensitive hide, sensitive for all its thickness, so that in his frenzy to both rescue his friend and escape the hated fire he had all but crushed the life from the ape-man. Lifting his burden high above his head, the giant beast wheeled and raced for the breach that he had just made in the palisade. The sheikh, rifle in hand, rushed from his tent directly into the path of the maddened brute. He raised his weapon and fired once. The bullet missed its mark, and Tantor was upon him, crushing him beneath those gigantic feet as he raced over him as you and I might crush out the life of an ant that chanced to be in our pathway. And then, bearing his burden carefully, Tantor, the elephant, entered the blackness of the jungle. Chapter 26. Miriam, dazed by the unexpected sight of Korak, whom she had long given up as dead, permitted herself to be led away by Baines. Among the tents he guided her safely to the palisade, and there, following Korak's instructions, the Englishman pitched a noose over the top of one of the upright logs that formed the barrier. With difficulty he reached the top, and then lowered his hand to assist Miriam to his side. "Come," he whispered. "We must hurry." And then, as though she had awakened from a sleep, Miriam came to herself. Back there, fighting her enemies, alone, was Korak her Korak. Her place was by his side, fighting with him and for him. She glanced up at Baines. "Go," she called. "Make your way back to Bwana and bring help. My place is here. You can do no good remaining. Get away while you can and bring the big Bwana back with you." Silently, the Honorable Morrison Baines slid to the ground inside the palisade to Miriam's side. "It was only for you that I left him," he said, nodding toward the tents they had just left. "I knew that he could hold them longer than I and give you a chance to escape that I might not be able to have given you. It was I, though, who should have remained. I heard you call him Korak, and so I know now who he is. He befriended you. I would have wronged you. No, don't interrupt. I'm going to tell you the truth now and let you know just what a beast I have been. I planned to take you to London, as you know, but I did not plan to marry you. Yes, shrink from me, I deserve it. I deserve your contempt and loathing, but I didn't know then what love was. Since I have learned that I have learned something else, what a cad and what a coward I have been all my life. I looked down upon those whom I considered my social inferiors. I did not think you good enough to bear my name. Since Hansen tricked me and took you for himself, I have been through hell, but it has made a man of me, though too late. Now I can come to you with an offer of honest love, which will realize the honor of having such as you share my name with me." For a moment Miriam was silent, buried in thought. Her first question seemed irrelevant. "How did you happen to be in this village?" she asked. He told her all that had transpired since the black had told him of Hansen's duplicity. "You say that you are a coward," she said, "and yet you have done all this to save me. The courage that it must have taken to tell me the things that you told me but a moment since, while courage of a different sort, proves that you are no moral coward. And the other proves that you are not a physical coward. I could not love a coward." "You mean that you love me?" he gasped in astonishment, taking a step toward her as though to gather her into his arms, but she placed her hand against him and pushed him gently away, as much as to say, "Not yet." What she did mean she scarcely knew. She thought that she loved him, of that there can be no question, nor did she think that love for this young Englishman was disloyalty to Korak, for her love for Korak was undiminished, the love of a sister for an indulgent brother. As they stood there for the moment of their conversation, the sounds of tumult in the village subsided. "They have killed him," whispered Miriam. The statement brought Baines to a realization of the cause of their return. "Wait here," he said. "I will go and see. If he is dead, we can do him no good. If he lives, I will do my best to free him." "We will go together," replied Miriam. "Come," and she led the way back toward the tent in which they last had seen Korak. As they went, they were often forced to throw themselves to the ground in the shadow of a tent or hut, for people were passing hurriedly to and fro now the whole village was aroused and moving about. The return to the tent of Ali Ben Kadin took much longer than had their swift flight to the palisade. Cautiously they crept to the slit that Korak's knife had made in the rear wall. Miriam peered within. The rear apartment was empty. She crawled through the aperture, Baines at her heels, and then silently crossed the space to the rugs that partitioned the tent into two rooms. Parting the hangings, Miriam looked into the front room. It too was deserted. She crossed to the door of the tent and looked out. Then she gave a little gasp of horror. Baines at her shoulder looked past her to the sight that had startled her, and he too exclaimed, but his was an oath of anger. 100 feet away they saw Korak bound to a stake, the brush piled about him already alight. The Englishman pushed Miriam to one side and started to run for the doomed man. What he could do in the face of scores of hostile blacks and Arabs he did not stop to consider. At the same instant, Tantor broke through the palisade and charged the group. In the face of the maddened beast, the crowd turned and fled, carrying Baines backward with them. In a moment it was all over, and the elephant had disappeared with his prize, but pandemonium reigned throughout the village. Men, women, and children ran helter-skelter for safety. Curs fled yelping. The horses and camels and donkeys, terrorized by the trumpeting of the pachyderm, kicked and pulled at their tethers. A dozen or more broke loose, and it was the galloping of these past him that brought a sudden idea into Baines' head. He turned to search for Miriam, only to find her at his elbow. "The horses," he cried. "If we can get a couple of them." Filled with the idea, Miriam led him to the far end of the village. "Loosen 2 of them," she said, "and lead them back into the shadows behind those huts. I know where there are saddles. I will bring them and the bridles," and before he could stop her, she was gone. Baines quickly untied 2 of the restive animals and led them to the point designated by Miriam. Here he waited impatiently for what seemed an hour but was in reality but a few minutes. Then he saw the girl approaching beneath the burden of 2 saddles. Quickly they placed these upon the horses. They could see by the light of the torture fire that still burned that the blacks and Arabs were recovering from their panic. Men were running about gathering in the loose stock, and 2 or 3 were already leading their captives back to the end of the village where Miriam and Baines were busy with the trappings of their mounts. Now the girl flung herself into the saddle. "Hurry," she whispered. "We shall have to run for it." Ride through the gap that Tantor made, and as she saw Baines swing his leg over the back of his horse, she shook the reins free over her mount's neck. With a lunge, the nervous beast leapt forward. The shortest path led straight through the center of the village, and this Miriam took. Baines was close behind her, their horses running at full speed. So sudden and impetuous was their dash for escape that it carried them halfway across the village before the surprised inhabitants were aware of what was happening. Then an Arab recognized them, and with a cry of alarm raised his rifle and fired. The shot was a signal for a volley, and amid the rattle of musketry, Miriam and Baines leapt their flying mounts through the breach in the palisade and were gone up the well-worn trail toward the north. And Korak? Tantor carried him deep into the jungle, nor paused until no sound from the distant village reached his keen ears. Then he laid his burden gently down. Korak struggled to free himself from his bonds, but even his great strength was unable to cope with the many strands of hard-knotted cord that bound him. While he lay there working and resting by turns, the elephant stood guard above him, nor was their jungle enemy with the hardihood to tempt the sudden death that lay in that mighty bulk. Dawn came, and still Korak was no nearer freedom than before. He commenced to believe that he should die there of thirst and starvation with plenty all about him, for he knew that Tantor could not unloose the knots that held him. And while he struggled through the night with his bonds, Baines and Miriam were riding rapidly northward along the river. The girl had assured Baines that Korak was safe in the jungle with Tantor. It had not occurred to her that the ape-man might not be able to burst his bonds. Baines had been wounded by a shot from the rifle of one of the Arabs, and the girl wanted to get him back to Bwana's home, where he could be properly cared for. Then she said, "I shall get Bwana to come with me in search for Korak. He must come and live with us." All night they rode, and the day was still young when they came suddenly upon a party hurrying southward. It was Bwana himself and his sleek, black warriors. At sight of Baines, the big Englishman's brows contracted in a scowl, but he waited to hear Miriam's story before giving vent to the long anger in his breast. When she had finished, he seemed to have forgotten Baines. His thoughts were occupied with another subject. "You say that you found Korak," he asked. "You really saw him?" "Yes," replied Miriam, "as plainly as I see you, and I want you to come with me, Bwana, and help me find him again." "Did you see him?" He turned toward the Honorable Morrison. "Yes, sir," replied Baines very plainly. "What sort of appearing man is he?" continued Bwana. "About how old, should you say?" "I should say he was an Englishman about my own age," replied Baines, "though he might be older. He is remarkably muscled and exceedingly tanned." "His eyes and hair, did you notice them?" Bwana spoke rapidly, almost excitedly. It was Miriam who answered him. "Korak's hair is black and his eyes are grey," she said. Bwana turned to his headman. "Take Miss Miriam and Mr. Baines home," he said. "I am going into the jungle." "Let me go with you, Bwana," cried Miriam. "You are going to search for Korak." "Let me go too." Bwana turned sadly but firmly upon the girl. Your place, he said, is beside the man you love. Then he motioned to his headman to take his horse and commence the return journey to the farm. Miriam slowly mounted the tired Arab that had brought her from the village of the sheik. A litter was rigged for the now feverish Baines, and the little cavalcade was soon slowly winding off along the river trail. Bwana stood watching them until they were out of sight. Not once had Miriam turned her eyes backward. She rode with bowed head and drooping shoulders. Bwana sighed. He loved the little Arab girl as he might have loved an own daughter. He realized that Baines had redeemed himself, and so he could interpose no objections now if Miriam really loved the man, but somehow, some way, Bwana could not convince himself that the Honorable Morrison was worthy of his little Miriam. Slowly he turned toward a nearby tree. Leaping upward, he caught a lower branch and drew himself up among the branches. His movements were cat-like and agile. High into the trees he made his way and there commenced to divest himself of his clothing. From the game bag slung across one shoulder he drew a long strip of doe skin, a neatly coiled rope, and a wicked-looking knife. The doe skin he fashioned into a loincloth, the rope he looped over one shoulder, and the knife he thrust into the belt formed by his G-string. When he stood erect, his head thrown back and his great chest expanded, a grim smile touched his lips for a moment. His nostrils dilated as he sniffed the jungle odors. His grey eyes narrowed. He crouched and leaped to a lower limb and was away through the trees toward the southeast, bearing away from the river. He moved swiftly, stopping only occasionally to raise his voice in a weird and piercing scream, and to listen for a moment after for a reply. He had traveled thus for several hours when, ahead of him and a little to his left, he heard, far off in the jungle, a faint response, the cry of a bull ape answering his cry. His nerves tingled and his eyes lighted as the sound fell upon his ears. Again he voiced his hideous call and sped forward in the new direction. Korak, finally becoming convinced that he must die if he remained where he was, waiting for the succor that could not come, spoke to Tantor in the strange tongue that the great beast understood. He commanded the elephant to lift him and carry him toward the northeast. There recently Korak had seen both white men and black. If he could come upon one of the latter, it would be a simple matter to command Tantor to capture the fellow, and then Korak could get him to release him from the stake. It was worth trying, at least better than lying there in the jungle until he died. As Tantor bore him along through the forest, Korak called aloud now, and then in the hope of attracting Akute's band of anthropoids, whose wanderings often brought them into their neighborhood. Akute, he thought, might possibly be able to negotiate the knots he had done so upon that other occasion when the Russian had bound Korak years before, and Akute to the south of him heard his calls faintly and came. There was another who heard them too. After Bwana had left his party, sending them back toward the farm, Miriam had ridden for a short distance with bowed head. What thoughts passed through that active brain, who may say? Presently she seemed to come to a decision. She called the headman to her side. "I am going back with Bwana," she announced. The black shook his head. "No," he announced. "Bwana says I take you home, so I take you home." "You refuse to let me go?" asked the girl. The black nodded and fell to the rear where he might better watch her. Miriam half smiled. Presently her horse passed beneath a low-hanging branch, and the black headman found himself gazing at the girl's empty saddle. He ran forward to the tree into which she had disappeared. He could see nothing of her. He called, but there was no response, unless it might have been a low, taunting laugh far to the right. He sent his men into the jungle to search for her, but they came back empty-handed. After a while he resumed his march toward the farm, for Baines by this time was delirious with fever. Miriam raced straight back toward the point she imagined Tantor would make, for a point where she knew the elephants often gathered deep in the forest due east of the Sheikh's village. She moved silently and swiftly. From her mind she had expunged all thoughts, other than that she must reach Korak and bring him back with her. It was her place to do that. Then, too, had come the tantalizing fear that all might not be well with him. She upbraided herself for not thinking of that before, of letting her desire to get the wounded Morrison back to the bungalow blind her to the possibilities of Korak's need for her. She had been traveling rapidly for several hours without rest when she heard ahead of her the familiar cry of a great ape calling to his kind. She did not reply, only increased her speed until she almost flew. Now there came to her sensitive nostrils the scent of Tantor, and she knew that she was on the right trail and close to him she sought. She did not call out because she wished to surprise him, and presently she did, breaking into sight of them as the great elephant shuffled ahead, balancing the man and the heavy stake upon his head, holding them there with his upcurled trunk. Korak cried Miriam from the foliage above him. Instantly the bull swung about, lowered his burden to the ground and, trumpeting savagely, prepared to defend his comrade. The ape-man, recognizing the girl's voice, felt a sudden lump in his throat. Miriam, he called back to her. Happily the girl clambered to the ground and ran forward to release Korak, but Tantor lowered his head ominously and trumpeted a warning. Go back, cried Korak. He will kill you. Miriam paused. Tantor, she called to the huge brute. Don't you remember me? I am little Miriam. I used to ride on your broad back, but the bull only rumbled in his throat and shook his tusks in angry defiance. Then Korak tried to placate him, tried to order him away that the girl might approach and release him, but Tantor would not go. He saw in every human being other than Korak an enemy. He thought the girl bent upon harming his friend, and he would take no chances. For an hour the girl and the man tried to find some means whereby they might circumvent the beast's ill-directed guardianship, but all to no avail. Tantor stood his ground in grim determination to let no one approach Korak. Presently the man hit upon a scheme. Pretend to go away, he called to the girl. Keep downwind from us so that Tantor won't get your scent, then follow us. After a while I'll have him put me down and find some pretext for sending him away. While he is gone you can slip up and cut my bonds. Have your knife? Yes, I have a knife, she replied. I'll go now. I think we may be able to fool him, but don't be too sure. Tantor invented cunning. Korak smiled, for he knew that the girl was right. Presently she had disappeared. The elephant listened and raised his trunk to catch her scent. Korak commanded him to raise him to his head once more and proceed upon their way. After a moment's hesitation he did as he was bid. It was then that Korak heard the distant call of an ape. Akut, he thought. Good, Tantor knew Akut well. He would let him approach. Raising his voice, Korak replied to the call of the ape, but he let Tantor move off with him through the jungle. It would do no harm to try the other plan. They had come to a clearing, and plainly Korak smelled water. Here was a good place and a good excuse. He ordered Tantor to lay him down and go and fetch him water in his trunk. The big beast deposited him upon the grass in the center of the clearing. Then he stood with cocked ears and attentive trunk, searching for the slightest indication of danger. There seemed to be none, and he moved away in the direction of the little brook that Korak knew was some 200 or 300 yards away. The ape-man could scarce help smiling as he thought how cleverly he had tricked his friend, but well as he knew Tantor, he little guessed the guile of his cunning brain. The animal ambled off across the clearing and disappeared in the jungle beyond in the direction of the stream, but scarce had his great bulk been screened by the dense foliage than he wheeled about and came cautiously back to the edge of the clearing where he could see without being seen. Tantor by nature is suspicious. Now he still feared the return of the Shitarmangani who had attempted to attack his Korak. He would just stand there for a moment and assure himself that all was well before he continued on toward the water. Ah! It was well that he did. There she was now, dropping from the branches of a tree across the clearing and running swiftly toward the ape-man. Tantor waited. He would let her reach Korak before he charged. That would ensure that she had no chance of escape. His little eyes blazed savagely. His tail was elevated stiffly. He could scarce restrain a desire to trumpet forth his rage to the world. Miriam was almost at Korak's side when Tantor saw the long knife in her hand, and then he broke forth from the jungle, bellowing horribly, and charged down upon the frail girl. Chapter 27. Korak screamed commands to his huge protector in an effort to halt him, but all to no avail. Miriam raced toward the bordering trees with all the speed that lay in her swift little feet, but Tantor, for all his huge bulk, drove down upon her with the rapidity of an express train. Korak lay where he could see the whole frightful tragedy. The cold sweat broke out upon his body. His heart seemed to have stopped its beating. Miriam might reach the trees before Tantor overtook her, but even her agility would not carry her beyond the reach of that relentless trunk. She would be dragged down and tossed. Korak could picture the whole frightful scene. Then Tantor would follow her up, goring the frail little body with his relentless tusks, or trampling it into an unrecognizable mass beneath his ponderous feet. He was almost upon her now. Korak wanted to close his eyes, but could not. His throat was dry and parched. Never in all his savage existence had he suffered such blighting terror. Never before had he known what terror meant. A dozen more strides and the brute would seize her. What was that? Korak's eyes started from their sockets. A strange figure had leaped from the tree, the shade of which Miriam already had reached, leaped beyond the girl straight into the path of the charging elephant. It was a naked white giant. Across his shoulder a coil of rope was looped. In the band of his G-string was a hunting knife. Otherwise he was unarmed. With naked hands he faced the maddening Tantor. A sharp command broke from the stranger's lips. The great beast halted in his tracks, and Miriam swung herself upward into the tree to safety. Korak breathed a sigh of relief not unmixed with wonder. He fastened his eyes upon the face of Miriam's deliverer, and as recognition slowly filtered into his understanding, they went wide in incredulity and surprise. Tantor, still rumbling angrily, stood swaying to and fro close before the giant white man. Then the latter stepped straight beneath the upraised trunk and spoke a low word of command. The great beast ceased his muttering. The savage light died from his eyes, and as the stranger stepped forward toward Korak, Tantor trailed docilely at his heels. Miriam was watching too and wondering. Suddenly the man turned toward her as though recollecting her presence after a moment of forgetfulness. "Come, Miriam," he called, and then she recognized him with a startled "Bwana." Quickly the girl dropped from the tree and ran to his side. Tantor cocked a questioning eye at the white giant, but receiving a warning word let Miriam approach. Together the two walked to where Korak lay, his eyes wide with wonder and filled with a pathetic appeal for forgiveness, and mayhap a glad thankfulness for the miracle that had brought these two of all others to his side. "Jack," cried the white giant, kneeling at the ape-man's side. "Father," came chokingly from the killer's lips. "Thank God that it was you. No one else in all the jungle could have stopped Tantor." Quickly the man cut the bonds that held Korak, and as the youth leaped to his feet and threw his arms about his father, the older man turned toward Miriam. "I thought," he said sternly, "that I told you to return to the farm." Korak was looking at them wonderingly. In his heart was a great yearning to take the girl in his arms, but in time he remembered the other, the dapper young English gentleman, and that he was but a savage, uncouth ape-man. Miriam looked up pleadingly into Bwana's eyes. "You told me," she said, in a very small voice, "that my place was beside the man I loved," and she turned her eyes toward Korak, all filled with the wonderful light that no other man had yet seen in them, and that none other ever would. The killer started toward her with outstretched arms, but suddenly he fell upon one knee before her instead, and lifting her hand to his lips, kissed it more reverently than he could have kissed the hand of his country's queen. A rumble from Tantor brought the three, all jungle-bred, to instant alertness. Tantor was looking toward the trees behind them, and as their eyes followed his gaze, the head and shoulders of a great ape appeared amidst the foliage. For a moment the creature eyed them, and then from its throat rose a loud scream of recognition and of joy, and a moment later the beast had leaped to the ground, followed by a score of bulls like himself, and was waddling toward them, shouting in the primordial tongue of the anthropoid. "Tarzan has returned. Tarzan, lord of the jungle." It was Akut, and instantly he commenced leaping and bounding about the trio, uttering hideous shrieks and mouthings that to any other human beings might have indicated the most ferocious rage, but these three knew that the king of the apes was doing homage to a king greater than himself. In his wake leaped his shaggy bulls, vying with one another as to which could spring the highest and which utter the most uncanny sounds. Korak laid his hand affectionately upon his father's shoulder. "There is but one Tarzan," he said. "There can never be another." 2 days later the three dropped from the trees on the edge of the plain, across which they could see the smoke rising from the bungalow and the cookhouse chimneys. Tarzan of the apes had regained his civilized clothing from the tree where he had hidden it, and as Korak refused to enter the presence of his mother in the savage half-raiment that he had worn so long, and as Miriam would not leave him, for fear, as she explained, that he would change his mind and run off into the jungle again, the father went on ahead to the bungalow for horses and clothes. My dear met him at the gate, her eyes filled with questioning and sorrow, for she saw that Miriam was not with him. "Where is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Muviri told me that she disobeyed your instructions and ran off into the jungle after you had left them. Oh, John, I cannot bear to lose her too." And Lady Greystoke broke down and wept, as she pillowed her head upon the broad breast where so often before she had found comfort in the great tragedies of her life. Lord Greystoke raised her head and looked down into her eyes, his own smiling and filled with the light of happiness. "What is it, John?" she cried. "You have good news, do not keep me waiting for it." "I want to be quite sure that you can stand hearing the best news that ever came to either of us," he said. "Joy never kills," she cried. "You have found her. She could not bring herself to hope for the impossible." Yes, Jane, he said, and his voice was husky with emotion. I have found her, and him. Where is he? Where are they? She demanded. Out there at the edge of the jungle. He wouldn't come to you in his savage leopard skin and his nakedness. He sent me to fetch him civilized clothing. She clapped her hands in ecstasy and turned to run toward the bungalow. Wait, she cried over her shoulder. I have all his little suits. I have saved them all. I will bring one to you. Tarzan laughed and called to her to stop. The only clothing on the place that will fit him, he said, is mine if it isn't too small for him. Your little boy has grown, Jane. She laughed too. She felt like laughing at everything, or at nothing. The world was all love and happiness and joy once more, the world that had been shrouded in the gloom of her great sorrow for so many years. So great was her joy that for the moment she forgot the sad message that awaited Miriam. She called to Tarzan after he had ridden away to prepare her for it, but he did not hear and rode on without knowing himself what the event was to which his wife referred. And so an hour later Korak, the killer, rode home to his mother, the mother whose image had never faded in his boyish heart, and found in her arms and her eyes the love and forgiveness that he pleaded for. And then the mother turned toward Miriam, an expression of pitying sorrow erasing the happiness from her eyes. My little girl, she said, in the midst of our happiness a great sorrow awaits you. Mr. Baines did not survive his wound. The expression of sorrow in Miriam's eyes expressed only what she sincerely felt, but it was not the sorrow of a woman bereft of her best beloved. I am sorry, she said quite simply. He would have done me a great wrong. But he amply atoned before he died. Once I thought that I loved him. At first it was only fascination for a type that was new to me, then it was respect for a brave man who had the moral courage to admit a sin, and the physical courage to face death to right the wrong he had committed. But it was not love. I did not know what love was until I knew that Korak lived, and she turned toward the killer with a smile. Lady Greystoke looked quickly up into the eyes of her son, the son who one day would be Lord Greystoke. No thought of the difference in the stations of the girl and her boy entered her mind. To her, Miriam was fit for a king. She only wanted to know that Jack loved the little Arab wife. The look in his eyes answered the question in her heart, and she threw her arms about them both and kissed them each a dozen times. Now, she cried, I shall really have a daughter. It was several weary marches to the nearest mission, but they only waited at the farm a few days for rest and preparation for the great event before setting out upon the journey, and after the marriage ceremony had been performed they kept on to the coast to take passage for England. Those days were the most wonderful of Miriam's life. She had not dreamed even vaguely of the marvels that civilization held in store for her. The great ocean and the commodious steamship filled her with awe. The noise and bustle and confusion of the English railway station frightened her. If there was a good-sized tree at hand, she confided to Korak, I know that I should run to the very top of it in terror of my life, and make faces and throw twigs at the engine. He laughed back. Poor old Numa, sighed the girl. What will he do without us? Oh, there are others to tease him, my little Mangani assured Korak. The Greystoke townhouse quite took Miriam's breath away, but when strangers were about none might guess that she had not been to the manor born. They had been home but a week when Lord Greystoke received a message from his friend of many years, Dianot. It was in the form of a letter of introduction brought by one General Armand Jacquet. Lord Greystoke recalled the name, as who familiar with modern French history would not, for Jacquet was in reality the Prince de Cadrenet, that intense republican who refused to use, even by courtesy, a title that had belonged to his family for 400 years. There is no place for princes in a republic, he was wont to say. Lord Greystoke received the hawk-nosed, grey-moustached soldier in his library, and after a dozen words the two men had formed a mutual esteem that was to endure through life. I have come to you, explained General Jacquet, because our dear Admiral tells me that there is no one in all the world who is more intimately acquainted with Central Africa than you. Let me tell you my story from the beginning. Many years ago my little daughter was stolen, presumably by Arabs, while I was serving with the Foreign Legion in Algeria. We did all that love and money and even government resources could do to discover her. But all to no avail. Her picture was published in the leading papers of every large city in the world, yet never did we find a man or woman who ever had seen her since the day she mysteriously disappeared. A week since there came to me in Paris a swarthy Arab who called himself Abdul Kamak. He said that he had found my daughter and could lead me to her. I took him at once to Admiral D. Arnott, whom I knew had traveled some in Central Africa. The man's story led the Admiral to believe that the place where the white girl, the Arab supposed to be my daughter, was held in captivity was not far from your African estates, and he advised that I come at once and call upon you that you would know if such a girl were in your neighborhood. What proof did the Arab bring that she was your daughter? Asked Lord Greystoke. None, replied the other. That is why we thought best to consult you before organizing an expedition. The fellow had only an old photograph of her on the back of which was pasted a newspaper cutting describing her and offering a reward. We feared that having found this somewhere it had aroused his cupidity and led him to believe that in some way he could obtain the reward, possibly by foisting upon us a white girl on the chance that so many years had elapsed that we would not be able to recognize an impostor as such. Have you the photograph with you? Asked Lord Greystoke. The general drew an envelope from his pocket, took a yellowed photograph from it, and handed it to the Englishman. Tears dimmed the old warrior's eyes as they fell again upon the pictured features of his lost daughter. Lord Greystoke examined the photograph for a moment. A queer expression entered his eyes. He touched a bell at his elbow, and an instant later a footman entered. Ask my son's wife if she will be so good as to come to the library, he directed. The two men sat in silence. General Jacquot was too well bred to show in any way the chagrin and disappointment he felt in the summary manner in which Lord Greystoke had dismissed the subject of his call. As soon as the young lady had come and he had been presented, he would make his departure. A moment later Miriam entered. Lord Greystoke and General Jacquot rose and faced her. The Englishman spoke no word of introduction. He wanted to mark the effect of the first sight of the girl's face on the Frenchman, for he had a theory, a heaven-born theory, that had leaped into his mind the moment his eyes had rested on the baby face of Jane Jacquot. General Jacquot took one look at Miriam, then he turned toward Lord Greystoke. How long have you known it? He asked, a trifle accusingly. Since you showed me that photograph a moment ago, replied the Englishman. It is she, said Jacquot, shaking with suppressed emotion, but she does not recognize me. Of course she could not. Then he turned to Miriam. My child, he said, I am your. But she interrupted him with a quick, glad cry as she ran toward him with outstretched arms. I know you, she cried. Oh, now I remember, and the old man folded her in his arms. Jack Clayton and his mother were summoned, and when the story had been told them, they were only glad that little Miriam had found a father and a mother. And really, you didn't marry an Arab waif after all, said Miriam. Isn't it fine? You are fine, replied the killer. I married my little Miriam, and I don't care for my part whether she is an Arab or just a little Tarmangani. She is neither, my son, said General Armand Jacquot. She is a princess in her own right. The end. Best audiobooks for free. Hope that you have enjoyed this production of Edgar Rice Burroughs' The Son of Tarzan. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.